I think one of the biggest mistakes that people make in regard to Christianity, in regard to the Catholic faith in particular, but you could say this about any kind of Christianity, is they believe that Jesus Christ came here to teach us how to be better people. In other words, they believe that Jesus came to give us a code of ethics, a rule on how to behave, that over the centuries has turned into an uninspiring list of do's and don'ts, a boring set of rules that nobody understands, that oftentimes conflict with what the world says, and therefore people dismiss. I mean, if following God is just about obeying his laws and not getting struck by lightning, what's the point? And really, that's not worshiping God our Father. If that's the concept we have of God, we've got it wrong. You're not worshiping God, you're worshiping Zeus. God the Father sent us his Son, Jesus Christ, who offered himself on the cross out of love for us, that we might come into communion with the Father, that we might enter into the Father's love and allow his grace to transform us. In Jesus Christ, you and I have become a new creation. Not just a better person. This is why, with all due respect to Matthew Kelly out there and others, I don't like saying that Jesus calls you to be the best version of yourself. He calls us to be something beyond ourselves, something that we can never attain on our own. He calls us to be the perfect imitators of God the Father, and that's something we can only do by God's grace, which means it's not just about being better, it's about being transformed. We who are baptized are washed in the blood of Jesus Christ and rise to new life with him to enter into the feast of God's mercy. And everything we do in this life, here and now, points to that reality. The Eucharist is a sacrificial banquet through which we recall the passion, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ in a way that makes it present to us. And then we receive the gift of his body and blood, soul, and divinity. What an amazing gift we have in the Eucharist. But even the Eucharist itself is a sign. Now, notice I didn't say it's merely a symbol. The Eucharist is the body and blood, soul, and divinity of Christ. But it's given to us now in sacramental signs so that we might be transformed by the Eucharist. St. Augustine said, "Behold what you are, become what you receive, so that we can go out into the world and live as those transformed by grace to be the image of the loving Father." Our beautiful first reading, it's often said that Catholics don't know the Bible very well, and it's often right. Especially we're deficient on our understanding, I believe, often of the Old Testament. We don't really read, we don't know the Old Testament, and some people say, well, I don't like that Old Testament God, he's not very nice. As if there's two different gods. God hasn't changed. Our understanding of God has changed. God has revealed himself more and more to us throughout the course of divine revelation. And so this first reading that we have today comes from the book of Joshua. That is the 6th book of the Bible for you Catholics. Right after the book of Moses comes the book of Joshua. Joshua is Moses' successor. He is the one that leads his people into the promised land, which means that Joshua, in a sense, is what we in the biblical scholarship world would call a type for Jesus. It means that he's almost like a prefigure, a foreshadowing. He is pointing to Jesus. And if you don't believe me, let me give you a lesson in Hebrew. Joshua's name in Hebrew, Yeshua, right? is the same as Jesus. Now, we in the English language call Jesus by the Latin pronunciation of his name, Jesus, Jesus, to distinguish between him and other Joshuas in the Bible. So Yeshua, Joshua, the successor of Moses, Jesus himself would be the ultimate successor of Moses, right? We know that. Remember the story we had a couple weeks ago, the Transfiguration. Moses like, there he is. So this Joshua led his people to the promised land. And when did they enter the promised land? They entered it on the day after Passover. Oh, what happened at Passover? God had freed his people from slavery in Egypt and led them through the Red Sea to freedom. But they preferred slavery. And they sinned against God again and again and again, to where Yeshua, Joshua, was the only Israelite who was over the age of 20 at the time of the Exodus that was able to set foot into the promised land. And the day they entered the promised land, it says here, the manna ceased. Now, if you remember what the manna is, the manna was a form, a wafer-like substance that appeared every morning that they were able to somehow make some kind of cakes or bread out of. And if you remember, manna comes from a loose translation of the word manna is, what the heck is this? It was like, what is this? What is it? I don't understand. We'll call it manna. I don't know. We'll eat it here. I should live so long. Could I get a nice brisket? I don't know. So the manna ceased. The manna ceased the moment they entered into the promised land. Just like, as I say, the moment we enter into the goodness of God's glory, we won't even need the sign of the Eucharist anymore, because we will be feasting on the eternal love of God the Father given to us in his Son, Jesus Christ. And the whole point of the Eucharist is that this can transform us into the loving image of the Father, and for us, his children, to enter into the promised land. Now you might say, Father, you haven't even talked about the prodigal son yet. Don't worry. I'm here. Now I said earlier that us Catholics don't know the Bible. But see, I think we do in ways that we don't understand, because the moment I proclaimed this gospel and I said, there is a father who had two sons, you knew the story right away. You knew that there was going to be this story about this guy. And if you were really this guy that wasn't a very nice guy, by the way, he was kind of a jerk. Wrote off his dad, squandered his inheritance, and came back home. And if you're really advanced, you remember that there's this other son that's not so happy about what's going on. Now, if I asked some Catholics where that is, they might say, I don't know, Lent. If I asked you where it was in the Bible, you might say Lent. It's here in the 15th chapter of St. Luke's Gospel. And it comes after three parables. It's the third in a list of parables. The first one's about a lost sheep, then about a lost coin, and now about a lost son. But we have to contextualize this, and this is why our lectionary takes us back to the beginning of the 15th chapter so we can hear the context in which Jesus is saying these words. Tax collectors and sinners were all drawing near to listen to Jesus, but the Pharisees and the scribes began to complain, saying, "This man welcomes sinners and eats with them." We have two sons in this parable, two sons who equally make the same mistake in their understanding of the relationship they have with their father. Both sons had fallen into the mentality that their father was a slave master, that it was their job to do whatever the father asked them and told them to do, and that if they did that, they'd get what was coming to them. They'd get what they deserved. The first son sees his father's house as a place of rules, a place of oppression. And he decided that he knew better what was best for him. And it wasn't living under his father's thumb, being oppressed by his father's rules. He didn't see himself as a son. He saw himself as a slave and chose to do something different. Not unlike my brothers and sisters, God's people Israel, wandering in the desert, that though God had freed them from real slavery, from terrible slavery, from harsh treatment, and led them to their own freedom, they still preferred their will over God's. And so this son goes, and according to some of the references we have here, he has a pretty good time. He goes to Vegas, probably has the shrimp buffet, and maybe visits a few houses of ill repute, squanders all of his money after not too long on a time of party, and then he's forced to do the lowest thing, the lowest possible thing that a Jewish man could do at the time, which was to feed pigs. Pigs were gross, unclean animals. As a Jew, you weren't allowed to eat them or touch them, and now all of a sudden the pigs are his best friends. So much that he wanted to eat. The pig wouldn't even share. What a not nice pig. Wouldn't even share his food with him, you know? But he still doesn't get it. He still has that slave mentality. Look, my father's hired hands, his servants, they eat better than this pig. My father will hire me. I'll go back into his house. It's pretty much the same thing, right? I'll just be a hired worker instead of a son. I'll still live in the house and get a lot of the benefits, and at least I'll get a decent wage and not have to eat whatever I'm not eating right now. And so the father sees him coming down the road. Now, the only one who acts differently than one would expect him to act in this parable is the father. The father sees his little boy coming down the road. You know, this means that every day that father must have been looking out the window, looking down the road, looking and waiting. Is today going to be the day? Is today going to be the day he's going to come home? Not thinking about how angry he is with his son or the way he's going to punish him, which this was all called for by the law. I mean, there were terrible shaming rituals of bringing someone back who had squandered the family's property in the way this kid did. Things that involved throwing rotten vegetables at him and having him basically in the first century Hebrew equivalent to the stocks, you know, that we had in 17th century America. You know, where he'd get to be ridiculed by the whole town. And then when he experienced the shame that he himself had brought upon his family, then maybe he could come back in some way as a slave or a hired hand. But the father didn't even think about that. Didn't even cross his mind. He looks at his son. He says, put a robe around him. He's mine. He doesn't belong in these shabby clothes. He doesn't need to be barefoot. Put a ring on his finger. He has full authority over all my accounts and all my property again. And we are going to kill the fatted calf and have a party because my son is home, and that's all that matters. The son was sorry. The father wasn't even going to hear any of this hired hand business. I don't deserve to be called your son. It's almost like the father said, I know it, I don't care. You don't have to earn my love, son. You don't have to work hard for my love. Don't you get it? I love you because you're my son. God loves us because he's good, not because we're good. And then you have this other son. Now, a friend of mine I was talking to on the phone, my buddy Father Ryan, last night, and he said if there was a female version of this story, the second son's name might be Karen. If your name happens to be Karen, I'm sorry. This other son sees everything that's going on and says, Dad, I don't get you. I've been the good son. I've done everything. See, again, I obeyed your orders. I followed your rules. Your boring list of rules, I did it. Your uninspiring list of do's and don'ts, I didn't break one of them. And you never gave me some Kobe beef. You never gave me some good veal on this fatted calf. And this guy, this jerk, comes back. And I don't get you, Dad. He's angry. And maybe some of us think he was right. Because the Father's ways are not our ways. God's so much more merciful than we are. And that's when the Father looks at the Son and says, Son, you're always here with me. Everything I have is yours. You're not my slave. You're my son. That fatted calf could have been that boy's anytime he wanted to. The whole property, the whole run of the Father's land, all of the Father's abundance, goodness, and possessions belong to him as a co-heir, as a son. But instead, he saw himself as a slave, as a servant. So for that reason, he was better than the other son because he was a better servant. He was a better slave. But the Father's love is not about whether or not you're good enough. The Father's love is about his goodness, his kindness, and his mercy. And thank God for that. Because so many times in my life, I've been the prodigal, wandering away from the Father's love, chasing my own will and my own dreams and my own ideas of things. And then it just ends up being a big pile of pig poop. And every time, every single time, I've been welcomed back into God's mercy. He never gets tired of it. We might get tired of coming back, but he doesn't get tired of receiving us. And then I think we can be like the other one too. Look, I'm doing everything right. I've been doing it all along. Life isn't going the exact way I want it. Surely God hates me, doesn't love me. Instead, the Father says to us, you're my son. And by the way, I say son in the inclusive sense. That applies to all of us. I don't have time to list all 7 genders that we're supposed to have now. So when I say son or brethren, I'm being gender inclusive, okay? You're my son. We're not God's slaves or just his servants. I mean, we're called to be good and faithful servants in the way that a son is, but we're more than that to him. We're not just functionaries to God. We're his beloved sons and daughters. And sometimes we can resent because there might be people at church, there might be people around us, and maybe they don't get it all yet. Maybe they haven't had life figured out. Guess what? Being a Christian, my brothers and sisters, is not about having life figured out. It's not about being perfect and being well put together. Being a Christian is about being able to say, I am a hot mess. And only God's grace can save me. Only his mercy that I don't deserve, that I don't earn. And what I love that happens in this gospel is it's open-ended. We don't know how this parable ends. Jesus doesn't resolve it for us. He leaves us on a cliffhanger. It is a choose-your-own-adventure novel. For those of you that are old enough to remember those. In other words, we're the Son. We're outside the feast. The party's going on. The fatted calf has been slaughtered. Are we going to sit here folding our arms, crossed, upset, and sad because we don't fully understand God's love? Or are we going to allow God's love to change us, to transform us, to make us, as St. Paul calls us, a new creation, alive in the mercy of Jesus Christ, to enter into the eternal feast of God's kingdom that has no end, which begins with the feast of his love given to us here and now on this altar, and our great Paschal feast in which he gives us his body, his blood, his soul, and divinity. He gives us all of himself because we're not his slaves. We're his sons.